slides. All right, so that's for logistics. And now just to remind everyone who haven't been here for the first session that the Konekt campaign is organized by Unibureau, Phil, and Sunplake. We are three distinct organizations, but we all work in philanthropy, and your causes are really dear to our heart. So we united in our efforts to help you succeed, especially in this uneasy and uncertain times. And now I would like the presenters to say a quick hello. Oh, I'm sorry.
Next slide.
Oh, next slide. There you go.
That's my cue. Hi, everybody. Kim Fuller, I'm founder and CEO of Phil. And today I'll be talking about your most engaged volunteers, your board members, and how to work with them through difficult times.
Hi, everybody. I'm François Decaret, co-founder and director at the fundraising suite Simplicate. Today, I will talk about volunteer management and recruitment.
And as you know, I'm Julia, and today I would like to share with you some of the tools for automation and how to manage volunteers. It's a volunteer week here, so we wanted to put the spotlight on that. Salesforce has an amazing module how we manage volunteers, but even if you don't have one, I'll try to share my tips and insight how you can do it through creating maybe some automations within your let's say Outlook or Gmail. All right, next slide. So now I'll pass the word to Kim for your cue. Just give us a second to do some.
Thanks, Julia. So welcome, everybody. Really excited to talk to you today about governance in a time of crisis. So when I talk about governance, I'm not only speaking as a consultant, but I'm also speaking as a volunteer myself. I've been on several boards over the years and have had the privilege of being chair of a couple of those boards. And so this gives me a perspective, a unique perspective on leadership and governance based on real experiences. And my own boards have been put to the test in the last few weeks. So a lot of what I'll be sharing with you today are some lessons learned, and hopefully you'll find them helpful as you move forward and navigate through this crisis. We need to remember that our volunteers with the utmost responsibility are our board members, and during a time of crisis, they can be our greatest ally or our worst enemy. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some tips today on how to keep everything going smoothly in the right direction. So crisis is the ultimate test of strength, and I'm sure you've been feeling lately, if you're at the head of an organization or a board, that you've truly been put to the test in the last month or so. And right now, what I'm seeing is that our clients who have good governance are managing pretty well. They are less stressed than those who have poor governance. So there's really a very clear line differentiating the two. And that's why I felt that this topic was super important to share. And based on the responses that we got from you in the poll that we did after our first webinar, this was a hot topic for many. So as you know, the reputation, the skills, and the commitment and judgment of the board of directors are crucial in a time of crisis. And you know, let's start by defining a crisis. What is an actual crisis, right? So it's a risk that threatens to substantially disrupt, damage, or destroy an organization's operations, business, or reputation. And right now, we're all in the same boat. The unique quality of the COVID crisis is that we're all in it together. We're all being affected by this. It isn't one singular thing that's happening to one singular organization. It's happening to all of us. So this is quite a unique thing to be living together, and hopefully we can learn from each other as well. So what's the role of a board? Well, a board should be making sure that the organization has a risk management program in place, that the management team is active and reactive and open to identifying and managing risk. That's one of their first responsibilities. If the organization already has a formal crisis management system in place or a plan in place, then generally the executive director should handle the immediate needs, and the board members should provide guidance and support to the management team, and support the communication strategy, see where they can be useful. It can be a challenge because most directors will be predisposed to wanting to fix everything and address the crisis head on. But we really, board members need to remember that they should only really get involved where they're most needed. And managing that can be a little tricky at times. Hopefully we'll be able to give you some tips today. So in terms of communications, according to a recent blog post by BoardSource, not only should the board be thinking about the effects of COVID-19 on the planning for potential risks, it needs to consider what and how the organization will communicate with the staff, with leaders of the community and the community it serves, its beneficiaries. A good starting point for a crisis communications plan is to have a frank discussion between the executive director and the board centered on these questions. So what exactly should we be sharing with our public? What are the main, who's going to be the main point of contact for communications? So this can either be somebody who's appointed within the staff who is knowledgeable on the subject, or it can also be a volunteer like a board member who can be your spokesperson. When I'm using the term spokesperson throughout this presentation today, I'm not talking about like a porte-parole, a famous star spokesperson in that sense. I'm saying someone who's responsible for carrying the message of the organization. You should also be looking at, whether you need to create a mini task force that's going to focus solely on the crisis so that everybody else can try and keep going as best as they can with their usual responsibilities, if that's possible to maintain. And also, who's in charge of what during the crisis, because you will have to recognize that certain responsibilities are going to have to set aside to manage the crisis, as to not burn out your most valuable resources, your team and your staff, right? So once it hits, what do we do? There are 5 things to keep in mind, and this list was inspired by a report called "The Board Role in Crisis Management" by the law firm Osler. And number 1 is identifying the problem. Well, with COVID, we understand what the real problem is, right? And it's been defined as a pandemic, and we just need to understand that a crisis can be on many levels. And I want you to take this advice and these tips into the future so that whatever crisis happens in your organization, that you'll feel prepared for it, just as well as hopefully these tips will help you get through this one. But a crisis can be of your reputation, it can be mismanagement, it could be fraud, it could be a number of things that's keeping you from delivering on your mission that may lead to lawsuits, So it's important to understand and take the time to identify what's at the core of the problem and identify the issue as quickly as possible. Identifying the effects of the problem on the organization. This is where it's key to keep your board informed at all times. You need to report to your board regularly, even more regularly than you normally would. It helps to include the boards in the decision-making process, which can support the executive director and the staff. So be sure to be looping them in on a regular basis. Understanding the risks and potential consequences. Well, I mean, in COVID, is it a question of, your organization's challenges are financial? Is it a disruption of service? What is it that is the biggest problem? There can be a number of different implications that can arise, and you need to write them all down and prioritize them as best you can. In terms of asking for help, this is where your volunteers are key in a time of crisis. The board and the extended volunteer network can be a huge asset to your organization. And you can have, volunteers that are skilled in communications to help you write, certain communiques to your stakeholders. If you have, if you have to revisit your finances, let's get your treasurer involved. If it's a question of, fundraising and donor management and stakeholder management, maybe you have volunteers on your board who are, seasoned in philanthropy that can help coach you there. So, just try to reach out and use those resources as best you can. Investigate and acting and reporting, no matter how bad it gets, you need to keep all the stakeholders engaged and informed. And there's so much misinformation circulating on the web right now. People can jump to conclusions. You really have to get your communications in order so that you can reassure your donors that your organization is going to get through this, and that you need them to be there for you through thick and thin. So it's best to take action. And if you sit back and if you're too quiet for too long, you will be forgotten. And so you need to keep those lines of communications open. What to discuss when you sit down with your board and your leadership team. First and foremost, talk about your team. How does this crisis affect your team? If you can't get your team in order and protected from the crisis, you're not going to be able to move forward without your team. So that's top of the list. Then you need to look at how it's going to affect your beneficiaries, donors, funders. What are their budgets looking like? Do we have to rerun the numbers with the new reality if we've had to cancel events, if we've had to shift things around? These are all things that have to be looked at. And then within your partnerships in your community, how, if you are cutting back on your services because you can't deliver, how does that affect the community at large? And then, is there a way to operate during the crisis? How are we going to recover? And what do we do if this ever happens again? And again, a crisis may not come in this form of a pandemic. It could be any of the other crisis situations that I listed earlier, but you need to be prepared. So that's why getting a plan together is quite key. Sorry, skipping ahead. And so what should a plan include? Well, this is where your board can also come in handy and participate in helping management develop and document a crisis management plan that meets the board's approval. And the key components of the plan should include financial review, having a media strategy, looking at the logistics for convening emergency board meetings. So, our organization tends to meet 6 or 7 times a year. You have to look at whether you have to increase that to every few weeks during the time of a crisis, and make sure that your board members are aware that you need them to be available more than normal, and agree on a schedule that can suit their schedules, because they're also going through their own crisis management, either through professional or personal situations of their own. So you need to keep that in mind as well. Reviewing policy statements. Are there things that you have in place? For example, on yesterday's webinar, somebody brought up the fact of having an AGM. They want to convert their AGM to a virtual AGM. And would it be legally binding, the things that would get voted on during a virtual AGM? So if you don't have it in your bylaws that you're allowed to do virtual AGMs, then you might want to consider adjusting those bylaws so that you can go forward with that activity. And also just having a good FAQ, put it up on your website. Those kind of things can help also the board members and your stakeholders be informed at all times throughout the crisis. Leadership, what are we looking for? What should a board be looking for in their executive team? It's a tall order, I've got to say. As I was preparing this slide, I went, wow, this is a lot to deliver on. But we're looking for executive directors or general managers to be able to balance quick action with time for thinking things through properly. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but you need to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. And for the executive directors on the webinar today, I'm sure you've been feeling that tremendous pressure of trying to find balance, perspective, and that sense of urgency, which can be really stressful. Being able to get clear and concise information from your leadership team is also key. And being prepared for the scrutiny of media and stakeholders. People can get very uptight and nervous during a time of crisis, and they want to know that everything's under control. So a good executive director should be able to handle that, and have a good temperament and the ability to handle things under pressure is also key. So this is usually the time where we see people's true colors, and I'm hoping that most of our friends out there are able to keep it together and keep strong with all of these added responsibilities during the crisis. The advice that I have for boards during a crisis, obviously, we have to be accountable and responsible for our actions. Donors are super they expect a lot nowadays. Donors are expecting transparency. They want, they know that the responsibility falls not only on the leadership team, but also on the board. So we need to be aware of that. You need to get out in front of the problems as soon as they're happening. Like I said earlier, don't hide. You've really got to get your messaging out there. And when the shit hits the fan, the public expect that the board knows what's going on. So that's why I started the conversation today with really opening up those lines of communications between the team and the board, because you don't want to be approached or contacted by media or by any stakeholder asking you a question about, how are you guys dealing with this? And the board member doesn't even know how to answer, because that puts a board member in a very difficult position, and you don't want them to be put on the spot, and you don't want them making up stuff because they don't have enough information. So that's why it's also really key to give them proper tools to communicate on behalf of the organization. And when they don't know what to say, they should be comfortable saying, so-and-so is the spokesperson at our organization about this crisis. Please feel free to reach out to them. So board members should also have that responsibility of, when they don't know the right things to say, they should point people in the right direction. The whole thing about don't overplan, I think I should just explain this, is that, even though I've been talking about planning, there is an element about, there's some things that are just so unpredictable. And I think we're feeling it week to week through COVID, that as best as it is to have a plan, we can't always necessarily follow it. So what I mean about don't overplan is, it's important to have the processes in place, and the procedures, but the plans themselves might have to be rejigged. But just having the processes and the procedures in place is really, really the important thing to remember here. And last but not least, supporting that executive director. So we talked about how stressful the leadership team, the position of being in a leadership position is at an organization right now. Reach out to your executive team, make sure that they're hanging in there, see what you can do to support their mental health and their stress levels so that they can do their job more effectively. How can the board help? Well, when I say consider and question management, I don't mean second guess management at every turn. That's not what I meant by this. I mean to be a sounding board and be available for healthy discussions around topics that are important and the topics at hand. So it's one thing to be able to offer advice, but then you don't want to also micromanage and take over, because that can undermine the executive director's role. So you have to find that healthy balance in there. Providing constructive feedback is also important, so that, because you can often feel like you're in your own little bubble when you're dealing with stress. So it's important that the board members feel that they can be available to the staff and to leadership team when the times are tough. After the crisis, it's nice to think forward a little bit when we can get our heads above water. Be sure to always be congratulating your team, and review with your management any learnings from the experience. Really do a good postmortem, a debrief on the situation, how the crisis was handled, and take notes for the next time, and make sure that if you didn't have a plan in place for this crisis, that you do have one in place for the next one, and that you review that plan as you do with your strategic plan every 3 to 5 years. You should be looking at that as well. Lastly, I just wanted to share a quick little reference tool for you that I discovered in the last couple of weeks. It is a fantastic tool that is available online and being updated regularly, produced by the McConnell Foundation. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need to know to help your organization get through the crisis. And because it's a Google Doc, it's updated all the time. You don't have to download anything. You can just click on all the links, and it's super, super helpful. So that's my time up for my presentation, and I'll be available very, very shortly for your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kim. Really, really interesting. It's the second time, but I learned new things. Like, I love the idea of having your board involved, but in the right part of your organization. Like, not everywhere, but at the right place. And it's probably helpful for them to know where's the right spot. So I'm François. I'm co-founder at Simplique. Our mission is to help nonprofits maximize their resources So human resources with volunteers, or financial resources with donation form and fundraising. And today I will talk about management and engagement of volunteers. Actually, I trying to move slides. Okay, it's coming. So I have a personal history with volunteering. So actually, I'm co-founder at SimplyK. I arrived in Montreal 5 years ago, and I was actually trying to find an organization to volunteers. I wanted to be involved in my community. And I realized it was very difficult for me to find the right organization. So I did make phone calls, I swear. But it was not easy, different. I was doing a master, so I have a tight schedule. Organization had their ways, and it was really difficult to find the right opportunity to volunteers. And that's why I co-founded SimplyK. So today, SimplyK is used by 3,000 organizations. And what I will discuss is, so volunteering, it's a huge subject because it's part of management and human being, and there's a ton you can say. This is my plan. So what's different from volunteers to a regular team is that your volunteers are not paid. They have different motivations than usual employees. And that's why we'll use really this loop as mobilize and reward to address the subject. You will see a lot of data from Quebec study about volunteering. So let's start with mobilize, because in an ideal world, you don't want to recruit volunteers. You always have a strong team and you keep them. So what can your volunteers do right now? Because obviously you can't meet with them, you can't have them at your organization, but a lot of support that was done in person can be done over the phone. I'm a volunteer for YMCA tutoring teenagers, and they have set up a Zoom system where we can keep doing the tutoring, which works, I think, good. I think it's a great idea. For all the people in isolation, sometimes a phone call or those kind of interaction can have a really, really strong impact. Then something's really useful. I don't know if you feel like me, but I'm a bit overwhelmed by all the possible grants and subventions and help possible from the government. And it's coming up every day. And I think some volunteers might be a really great resources. And finally, at SimplyK, we saw that a lot in the last 2 weeks, is that volunteers are more than ever involved in your fundraisers. Organizing a fundraiser, a huge part of the work will be related to budget and cost, like finding the venue, finding catering, the food, etc. So it's not great for volunteers because it's not the best to have them involved in the budget of the organization. But know that most of the work for a virtual fundraiser is more in ideation, finding the right tool, getting the information on the internet. They can do way more. And we see a really great virtual event happening with Zoom nowadays. So basically, those are three ideas, but as long as your volunteers still can see the link to your mission, they will still be there for you at home. And just to give some statistics of what the volunteers do, the most common action is personal support, so direct help, which would be today done on the phone, and then it's organizing events and fundraisers. So both are great ideas for volunteering. And finally, consulting and clerical work. For clerical work, you do need to be on a good cloud system. And I think if it's not the case, it's a great moment to getting started. Julia, we can give a lot of advice on cloud. So that's really a first introduction to the actions that your donor can do. If you have questions about that, you can always ask. But then what's really important for volunteers, even more than for a regular team, is to reward and say thank you a lot. So thank you is the basic. It's always good to have a reminder, but that's something that should be done as much as possible. And if we go a step further, the ideal would be to adapt the way you thank and reward your volunteers to their core motivation. So more than half of your volunteers, I'm just checking if I didn't receive any message of everything is going, you can hear me, yeah. So sorry about that. More than half your volunteers are there because they want to contribute to their community. They believe in your mission. So I think that's a great, for those, never forget to tell them what you're achieving thanks to them in terms of impact. If you're a food bank, how many meals were you able to deliver? If you're helping kids, how many, like what are the results? Really, really strong. So then some volunteers have different motivations. It can be skills and experience for their resume. And so maybe asking to be a reference is very strong. Some volunteers likes a lot being on the social media. So if you do some kind of Facebook post and you show a picture of all your volunteers, for some volunteers, they will love it. Some love perks like some few gifts and free meals, and or someone to socialize, so they will love having a drink or a Zoom 5 to 7. So I think that's a great way to go further and really reward depending on the person. And so then what's amazing is that if you reward and you have a strong connection with your volunteers, you can mobilize them again. And actually, statistics show that 66% volunteers to an organization donate to their organization. So here is a typical objection. So my volunteers, they already donate their time. I don't want to ask them for donations, for money. It makes sense. I understand this. But actually, they donate their time. Maybe their time is actually even more precious than their money. It depends. But they donate their time because they really believe in your mission. And so if they see that their money can have a great impact too, they will donate. Also, something that prevents donations, it's often the fact that people say, okay, I don't know exactly how my money will be used if I donate to the nonprofit. But if they are volunteering for you, they know exactly what you're going to do with their money. So it's perfect because they can see. And so the only advice I would have is do solicit your volunteers, but do it in a different way. Don't include them in the newsletter you send to everybody or to your recurrent donors, but really communicate with them as what they are, volunteers. So introduce we know you're already giving us a lot of time and that's really amazing. Here is how you could help us even more. If we were to go even further, your volunteers are your champions. They often, if they are really feeling well and they see they have an impact with you, they can introduce you to other volunteers. So that's why you won't have to recruit anymore. Then they can become future employees, but sometimes they don't even know that you're recruiting. So maybe that's something to also communicate separately, and they often become board members. So quick to finish, you still have some time to recruit your volunteers. It happens, of course. And here are a few tips really quickly. So the first one is to adapt your recruitment channels to your target. So if you want to have young volunteers because you think it's better for your mission or the population you're helping, on SimplyK, we really have a strong community of teenagers and millennials. I think I can recommend also jebénévole.ca, ivolunteer.ca, a bit an older population. Then Facebook, you have a ton of Facebook groups of volunteers, really easy to share your needs. And you can test, depending where you are, sometimes it's LinkedIn for skills. Sometimes it's Kijiji, arrondissement.com, Craigslist. You have a ton of ways, and like in an hour, you can share your volunteer opportunities everywhere. And then about that, 3 tips on your website if you're recruiting. So the first one is to make the first contact easy. So that was my introduction. Like if I would recommend stepping in the shoes of a volunteer and think, okay, what do I need to do to become a volunteer for my organization? So map the process, and the easier the better. So the best is probably a simple form. Get in touch, you write your name, your email, what you're interested in, and you call them back or you email them back. But yeah, the easier, the more volunteers you will get. And then if that's possible, sometimes it's really tough, but as much as possible, I would recommend progressive engagement. I know it's tempting to say, I don't want to recruit every 3 months, so I will ask them to commit to a full year. And I totally understand, but from the volunteer point of view, if they don't even know you, it's a bit like a first date. You don't know the organization, you don't really know the work you're going to do, so it can be tough to commit to a full year. A great way is to think, okay, 3 months engagement, or come once and see, and then your volunteers will stay because you reward them and because you care about them. And so I committed for 3 months at YMCA, and I've been volunteering there for 3 years. So at least it worked for me, and I think that can be useful. And finally, all your organization really have strong and inspiring stories. But the reason you exist is often really strong. People need you, and you can never talk too much about your history and your mission, and that will help a lot to get to strong relationships with your volunteers. So that's it for SimplyK. If you want to learn more, so it's a platform for fundraising and volunteering. So a lot of recruitment right now are virtual fundraisers. What people like about SimplyK, I think it's 100% free. So 100% of the donation goes to your organization. Julia, I think you can. Should I give you the control, or you can take the control back?
Yes, Francois, thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation. I listened to it again today in English, and it's learned a lot new things, and so true. So I'll just flip the slides.
I'm still controlling your screen, I think.
There you go.
Oh, thank you.
No problem. Well, hi everyone. Like many of you know me, I'm Julia, and today I would like to talk about specifically volunteer management. Kim talked about the boards and our most dedicated volunteers. Francois was a volunteer and talked about how to engage them and manage them. I would like to talk about real tools and platforms, the how-to of volunteer management. And I would like to focus on 7 stages of kind of steps that are important in that process. So Francois was a volunteer and still is, and I am as well in multiple organizations. But I also got a chance to manage volunteers in a project that I had, and I found that role to be very intense, very rewarding, but very intense. There's a lot of steps that taking place here, and I had to manage only 5. So those of you who manage more than 5, chapeau, like we say, because it is a lot of work, a lot of coordinations. And luckily, I mean, I had Salesforce to help me manage my 5 volunteers. But what are the steps and how we can break it down to look at them? Well, first, there's an application process, right? So many organizations who we work with have an application form that it goes either to mailbox, or even worse, sometimes it's just a paper form. People call in and the information stays on their Post-it notes or paper. And that kind of creates a dead end, because then it's very hard to evaluate them in the next step. It's very important to know when the people are available, what's their interest, have they complete their police check, and all the other attributes that are important for your specific case, for your organization. Once we recruit them and train them and we confirm their availabilities, then there comes the task of actually assigning them a job, a shift, and here's a lot of logistics around where to go. You know, do they need a specific additional training and to coordinate, and what do they do? All those details could be very difficult to manage. And with that, we need to, even when we found that person, we need to make sure we communicate, remind them where to go and when to show up, because, you know, they necessarily, not like employees, and know what they need to do. Then internally as an organization, it's very important to record the hours. The government requires it. We report them in our annual reports. These numbers are very important for funding. Step number 6 is often overlooked. We don't collect enough of our volunteer feedback, or if we do, we don't necessarily act on it. It's a very simple step, and I'll show you a couple of tips how you can get started there. Number 7 is more strategic step of collecting the insights and looking at the data and statistics that you do collect about your volunteer hours, and contemplating of how you can translate those insight and data into intelligence, and what you can do to actually use those numbers to guide your organizations further. So step number 1 is application process. As Francois said, depending on what your segment of volunteers that you're targeting, they might be coming through either a phone or some other source. Maybe they do need that still paper form to complete because that's most comfortable for them. Most organizations now use some kind of electronic application process. Salesforce does come with its own predefined volunteer form that integrates with your CRM. And as well, we often use a JotForm. A JotForm is a platform that you can get for free. Actually, 5 forms are free in general, but nowadays they have announced unlimited free editions for nonprofit organizations, given that so many nonprofits need help to go digital. And we love JotForm because it can be very easy to customize, yet when we want to make it very fancy, so to say, and put some integration and branding around the forms, you certainly can. The forms are bilingual, so if you're in Quebec, often we see Google Forms that are using the same field that is repeated in English and in French, so making it very user unfriendly and difficult to read. So in JotForm, you actually just flip it to different languages. There's a wide range of integrations. Those who know me, I like the tools that talk to one another and not stay in its own silo. So JotForm integrates with a range of different platforms. Is also available through Zapier. So it brings me to a point that whatever application form that you're using, make sure it doesn't stay in its original source, but rather it's transferred to your central, whether it's CRM, whether it's your global Google Sheet. Make sure that your data is transferred to a place where all of your application live, because if not, it's just a waste of your time, a waste of people's time applying as well, because if you don't consolidate them, they will just stay where they came from. In the next step, as people applied, often characteristics, we don't give it too much of a thought. Either we collect too much or we don't collect enough. And, it's actually a very important step to get what you need and not more, because forms do need to be somewhat concise, otherwise they're too long to complete. Mostly white characteristics that we use are availability, skills, interest, and commitment. Even that, as Francois said, are you available to work, recurrently, because we want those that recurrence. For example, here we would also rate our volunteers, something that we probably don't do enough when we evaluate our volunteers, because you as a volunteer manager probably know who are your best volunteers and who maybe not so great. And this is the way for you to kind of keep track of who you would like to invite to come back and what other suggestions you would have for those who maybe not so much. And all information is centralized in their profile. So as you see here, we work with a lot of shelters, and where police check, for example, is very important, whether it's a new one is due, when did they sign a confidentiality agreement, bringing everything together into their profile. And you don't have to have a Salesforce to have a profile. You can do that still in your Google Sheet, basically create those columns that are you think important, and they will grow and evolve as your time progresses. And will actually, you will see which attributes are not important, because those columns and in Salesforce, actually the fields will be empty. So with the time you will question yourself, well, we're not collecting what the people signed the media release consent. So maybe it's not that important. We think it's important, but it's not, because we're not completing it. So having a profile for each volunteer, actual and perspective, is very important. So you know what your volunteer body looks like. So here's an example how we would search it in Salesforce. There's a very cool feature that's called Find Volunteers, that whatever criteria you have for in a volunteer profile, you can search it. So if you're searching only for active volunteers who speak English, and only, let's say, females who are available on a Sunday and know how to do websites or have a camera or have a car, you can plug in those criteria and you'll be able to find, system will suggest you those who meet the criteria. And you don't have to have Salesforce. This is basically filters. If you are thinking about your Google Sheet, filters on your columns to pull out those who meet the criteria. Next comes assigning the shift. So you found the volunteer, you got their criteria, yes, they are available, but in order to organize your work, you need to create some kind of hierarchies or structure to your projects. And this is how we recommend to do it. This is how Salesforce does it. And I find it is very effective. Could be a little bit long to build in the beginning and get the hang of how the actual flow works. It is most effective to organize your projects into hierarchies. So let's say you have projects. A major project could be a food drive or a special effort, an event. Underneath that, you will create certain jobs. So you will have a greeter, you will have a volunteer coordinator, you will have somebody who will do the cleanup, and then you'll go into the shifts. So in a cleanup team or a maintenance team that will be helping you with the post-event activities. How many shifts you have, meaning who comes in from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m., who comes in from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And that way you know exactly when people are coming and who is coming when, to which job and to which specific project. Again, you don't have to use Salesforce, but that gets really, very detailed when you try to do it in Google Sheet. But organization takes time to plan and to put in place, but it's very rewarding when you have a large event going on and a big activity, because it will give you transparency in terms of not only logistics, but after, when you're reporting and look at the history, you'll be able to easily pull up who came when, why, and if something happens, you can always retrace those people who've been assigned to a certain shift, certain time. So here's an example how we do it in Salesforce. Here we have a job. We have a grocery delivery for actually COVID is a campaign. We have grocery deliveries. We have a recurrence of the jobs and all the shifts that were created assigned to that specific job. And then we can, from here, we actually even see how many volunteers have been matched with a certain shift and how many volunteers are missing, because the number that is always we look at is delta. How many do we still need in a specific shift or in a specific job? With that brings me to my step 4 and 5, communication, logistics, and volunteer hours. I find that step is most labor intensive as far as process. So if anywhere you would invest in this particular step. And here how it traditionally works in the sector. So when you have, when you need somebody for a job, you are gonna go either do a posting or go and search your database or your Google Sheet where you have volunteers. You would contact them and they say, hey, Julia, you're available from 9 to 5. You need to have a car and this is the activities that you will be doing. I might respond right away. I might respond later. And then if I do respond, you need to remind me a couple of times, Julia, your shift is coming up. Please don't forget to show up because we're counting on you. So that option 1 of prior to the shift activities, this is how we traditionally, at least how I see people get volunteers to do a certain job. And here's another thought. What if we do it in a different way? What if we, and this is the column in between, in the middle is the option 2. What if we treat our volunteer needs as organizational companies treat jobs? I mean, the only difference in this scenario is really that we're not necessarily providing monetary compensation for their services, but the idea is the same. What if we publish a job and say, hey, we are looking for help with this specific event, and this is what you will do during that task. Here are the times when I'm going to need you. Here are the requirements that you will need to meet in order to help us out. You need to have white shirt and black pants and know how to say hello in both languages, for example. So those could be the requirements, and post it as a job and have some kind of automation process and then to approve those volunteers. Because I hear from a lot of organizations that people say, well, yeah, but I want to be able to select who will actually do the job. And I completely understand that, because like we discussed, you want to choose the best volunteer for the job. Well, in Salesforce, we have a process where people can apply for a job, either current volunteers or prospective volunteers. Everyone can apply for a specific volunteer post or job. And then you as a volunteer manager will approve those who you think have the best fit. And furthermore, all the reminders for the shift, for the upcoming shift, those can be certainly automated. And that's when the CRM comes into play. So that process, I find that the communication, the reminders, and finding the right person for the job takes a lot of time. But we're not done here, because after the person shows up, you also need to take attendance. Did they show up? So basically confirm their hours. So this step, at least when I was managing volunteers, would take me a lot of time, even though I had people who would be a good fit. Sometimes I will have multiple people apply for the same shift and not enough for the other shifts. So by being able to approve them and have them apply to a specific job helped me to kind of elevate that step. So here's an example how Fondation Logique actually does it. So they here posted a specific job for they're looking for graphic designer, volunteer, and here they say exactly what they need. What you're going to do, the Facebook banner, the visuals. We would like you to know how to use Photoshop and be execute quickly and be on time. And if you want to apply, you apply specifics to this job. And when you apply to specifics to this job, on the right hand side, you guys see that's form. Once it completes, that doesn't go to the generic place where all the volunteers are. It actually puts them in a specific bucket that this person who applies interested in this specific role. That gives so much context to the person who will be who's applying for the job, because they're not just volunteering for anything. They know exactly what they're going to do. They know when and what's expected of them. And this form is standard from Salesforce, and the organization did it themselves, which is pretty cool. Next step is a follow-up. The follow-up process, usually by the time we get to the follow-up with our volunteers, we are so tired from the logistics and the management and the communications and the reminders. So boy, I don't, I can certainly understand why we forget to follow up with our volunteers. If you're very advanced and want to have a complex process, you can put again the JOT form to collect that feedback. Or even a simple email template like, hey, thanks for your help. How did it go? Would you like to share what you enjoyed? And would you like to, help us to improve your experience? And how would we do that? So that email does not have to, live somewhere, as long as you can create a simple Gmail template and Outlook template to send it to your volunteers after the shift and collect that feedback. Maybe not necessarily needs to go to a database, but something that you can understand how the experience went. Maybe there's been something that they wanted to share with you, but you didn't ask, so they didn't say. And the key is keep it short and keep it simple. Your objectives here is to understand what people enjoy the most and how you can get better. And then finally, intelligence and strategy. Often, all the nonprofits, registered nonprofits, are required to report their volunteer hours. Either those are board hours, those are also volunteer hours for reporting. A lot of food banks run on a lot of volunteers, many organizations do. And we all collect the data on what kind of jobs, what kind of activities they do. But as Francois has mentioned, 66% of volunteers also donate. So I often ask the people we work with, our clients, how are you using your volunteers? And often I see that they're being put in a completely different category of labor versus somebody that you need to steward and engage. I know one organization that actually takes the volunteer hours from their volunteer hours that they collect, and they translate them into dollars, and that enables them to have a conversation with their funders to say, hey, last year we have spent 10,000 hours that came from volunteers, and that means that our organizations that translates to so many dollars that we are able to rally ourselves from our volunteer body. Isn't that amazing? So being able to create those stories with data is very powerful. And what does it mean when hours comes from a certain job but not from the other job? That means many things, and that's a conversation that you need to have within the organization. And Francois brought a very good point about how do you steward and engage your volunteers in your fundraising efforts? Because if you are a volunteer at YMCA and you're a tutor and you receive the same solicitation request from them to support them further, I'm not surprised that you'll be disengaged, because like, wow, these guys obviously don't even know that I am a volunteer, and the conversation that they should be having with me is not the same that they should be having the conversation who doesn't volunteer. So being able to segment your volunteers to a different category and properly engage them, as long as you can identify, hey, Francois, you're a volunteer as well, and we appreciate your support. Would you be willing to consider us to becoming a donor as well, since you know what kind of work we do? So once a month, take that look into your metrics and really understand what they mean and what strategy you need to guide them into deepening the relationship with your volunteers, because they're your most dedicated supporters. Really quickly about Unibur and what we do. So what we, cloud is our space. and we do everything that's to do around Salesforce and the network around Salesforce, other cloud technology tools. So we basically implement Salesforce, and we'll take your processes of the nonprofits and customize a solution for you to make sure it fits your purposes. And many organizations don't know, but Salesforce is actually free 10 licenses for the CRA registered charities. This is obtained from the salesforce.org. And often I hear that people say like, oh, Julia, Salesforce is only for big companies. And I always tell them, no, actually we specialize in small and medium nonprofits implementations of Salesforce, because we think that you're the ones who need the most help in getting onto a powerful tool like Salesforce. We have clients where we have one user, and we have even some organizations where the entire Salesforce is run by volunteers. So myth, Salesforce is only for big guys, for sure. And with that, I will pass it over to Kim for a wrap up.
Thank you, Julia. That was great. I feel like that was a really nutritious way for our brains to spend a lunchtime. So thank you to Francois, thank you to Julia. Just to wrap up, for those of you who may not be aware, we have been in the midst of National Volunteer Week, which is why we picked this theme for our webinar today. And there's still time. There's still time. I hope we've given you some inspiration to show some love to your volunteers. And there's still time to give them a shout out. I have put a link for volunteer.ca. On that website, there is an amazing toolkit where you can download animated GIFs, there's posts, there's graphics, there's all sorts of stuff. If you don't have in-house resources to develop graphics and social media material, it's all ready to go in both languages. So please feel free to check out that resource. It is a really great one, and it is done every year. So if you're a bit late to it this year, please make sure that early in 2021 that you already start planning your volunteer recognition week, because it is like Francois said and Julia echoed, that these are amazing supporters to your organization, and the better we treat them, the more generous they'll be with our organization. I also wanted to mention Giving Tuesday now. So for those of you who are already familiar with Giving Tuesday, you know that it happens after Black Friday and Cyber Monday. We usually have Giving Tuesday end of November or beginning of December. However, this global initiative is now coming together for May 5th in response to COVID, and it's giving opportunities to organizations like yours to create a page, create a little campaign to raise money to help you with COVID-related urgencies. So there's a great opportunity there for you to raise some money. I know people are very hesitant right now to reach out to their public and ask for money, because we're all a little sensitive around the topic of revenues these days. But this is a really great way to put the ask out there, and you can get really creative. Even with a week left, you can still pull off putting together a page and posting it on the Giving Tuesday website and sharing it on your social media. So please go check that out. And last but not least, all three of our companies are eligible for, our services are eligible for the PACME grants, which are helping organizations with training and technology type of related projects. So please check that out. That's a tremendous opportunity for organizations right now to get access to money to pay for things that they normally can't afford and don't have time to implement. So if you got excited about the things that Julia was showing you and said, wow, that would make my life so much easier, now's the time to do it. And that you can click on these links when you get the PDF of this presentation, and you can go check it out. And then please follow up with us for questions. So all of our companies are here to help. Just reach out. We have resources on our website. We're offering free consultations. We have newsletters that are packed with helpful tips. Just let us know what you need and we'll figure it out together. We are planning a third Konect webinar towards the end of May. So we'll be taking any of your requests for what kind of content people will be interested in a few weeks. We'd love to hear from you. We do these for you, so we want to know what you need. And with that, I think we have some time left over for questions, so please don't be shy. We have Mitchell with us, who is from Julia's team, and he will be fielding the questions and moderating this part of the webinar. So thank you, Mitchell.
All right, hi everybody. As Kim said, my name is Mitchell and I will be moderating the questions today. So if you guys have any questions, please leave them in the Q&A section.